News from further afield, at least 41 people have died and dozens injured in a fire that broke out at a church in Cairo, Egypt. A police investigation has pointed to an electrical short circuit as the source of the blaze. Meanwhile, the suspect in a shooting in Jerusalem has handed himself over to the police. The shooting has been labeled a terror attack. For this and other stories, I'm joined now by eNCA correspondent Olly Barratt. He's in Erbil in northern Iraq. We'll talk about the call for a million-man march further down in our conversation, Olly. But what utter carnage in this incident that has happened in Giza in Egypt? 41 people dead. What do we know about the circumstances of this fire?
That's right. At least 41 people dead is what we're being told by local officials, and many more people injured as well. This, as you say, took place in a Coptic Christian church in Giza, which is Egypt's second largest city. We understand that there were as many as 5,000 people in the church or heading into the church for a service when this fire broke out. And we are hearing that the fire broke out at the entrance to this church, which really caused a lot of the problems because there was a stampede of people to try and get out, and that clearly caused as many of the problems maybe as the blaze itself. Local officials are saying that they believe that the fire may have been caused by some kind of electrical short circuit. We've been hearing from the president of Egypt, Abdel Fattah al-Sisi. He's offered his sincere condolences to all of the families. He says that all of the country's institutions are now going to be dedicated to finding out what happened, but also dealing with the aftermath of this incident, working with the families of victims.
And just moving to this situation in Israel, where there's been this shooting, it was targeting a bus, and several people have been injured there. But it happens in a context, Olly, doesn't it, of recent activity by the Israeli Defense Force in Gaza?
Absolutely it does. All of that tension is very much the wider context with which people are viewing this particular incident. Those airstrikes sent by Israel, but also Israel saying that it was targeting Palestinian militants who were sending rockets in the other direction, blame and counter-blame that led to, in the end, after several days of violence, that truce brokered by Egypt. And what we've seen now is a gunman targeting a bus in Old Jerusalem, in the Old City, near the Western Wall, one of the holiest sites in Jerusalem. Pilgrims on this bus were actually headed back away from it when the incident unfolded. As you were saying, the suspect, the gunman, is thought to have now handed himself into authorities, and police are clearly following up that lead. We've been hearing from the Israeli leader, Yair Lapid. He's been talking about making sure that anyone involved in this attack would pay a price for any harm to our civilians. We're told that it's around 8 people, at least 8 people who were injured in this attack, including one that was a pregnant woman. We also understand that at least 4 of the people that have been injured were from, we believe, one family that was visiting from New York. As I say, Israeli authorities now following up these leads and trying to work out the background of the suspect, and indeed whether the person that is in custody is indeed the suspect that they were looking for in connection with the attack.
Yeah, and shifting focus quite rapidly, Olly, here's one that we had not talked about in a while. I mean, the fatwa or decree that had been issued around Salman Rushdie. I think it dates back to about 1988 or thereabouts. I remember, in the early years reading about it, but it had sort of, disappeared from the limelight until this past week when Salman Rushdie was attacked. What do we know about his condition and the latest around that particular issue, and whether or not it is linked to that fatwa that was issued all those years ago by the Iranian Supreme Leader, Ayatollah Khomeini?
Yeah, you're quite right. That was back in 1988 that the book, The Satanic Verses, was published. A year later, that fatwa was issued, putting a multi-million-dollar bounty on the head of Salman Rushdie, but also anyone involved in the publication of that book. He went into hiding, essentially, for many years, but in recent years, we've seen much more of him, despite the fact that even though some Iranian governments have distanced themselves from that fatwa, they haven't formally rescinded it. It hasn't been formally rescinded by Iran, and so effectively, technically, it remains in place. We saw that attack. We're told that his condition is now improving, but remains serious indeed. We've also seen in the Iranian media some praise for the attack. We've heard a lot of conservative Iranian publications calling Salman Rushdie still an apostate. Press TV, the state-backed channel, has been talking about how he has been blasphemous with that book and continues to describe him in that way. One branch of Iranian media even called it a courageous attack and said bravo to it. So there's been a lot of reaction inside Iran. In the UK, one of the prime ministerial candidates, Rishi Sunak, has been saying that sanctions need to be imposed on the Iranian Islamic Revolutionary Guard. Now, there's no definitive link between the IRG and this particular incident, but that is certainly the way it's now being discussed in capitals around the world. But many people waiting for better news about Salman Rushdie as we do start to hear that his condition is stabilizing.
And lastly, Olly, the situation in Iraq where you are, Muqtada al-Sadr is calling for what is known as a million-man march. From my quick glance at what the story is about, it seems to be a bit of a stalemate, is it not? Calling for the dissolution of parliament, and it seems that call is being targeted at the judiciary, but the retort is that things are not that simple.
Completely right. It's an absolute political stalemate here in Iraq at the moment. 10 months after elections, we still don't have the formation of a proper government. There are real divides at the moment. Muqtada al-Sadr is often described in Western media as a firebrand critic. He is a Shia firebrand cleric. He is a Shia cleric, and he has millions of followers in this country. His party essentially won the last election, but couldn't put together a government, a coalition government that could command the support of Parliament. That effectively led to him pulling his parliamentarians out of Parliament and saying it should now be dissolved and fresh elections should be called. And he set a deadline of the end of the coming week for that to happen. The top court in this country says it can't do that. It doesn't have the power to move in that direction. It would have to be something decided by Parliament. You then have on the other side of the debate the pro-Iran coordination framework grouping, also Shiite. They say a government must be formed, a cabinet must be put together, and they blame Muqtada al-Sadr and his followers for this political crisis. So again, the blame being pointed back and forth between these two sides. But for the ordinary Iraqis in the population, what it means is they don't have a fully functioning government. It can't get on top of things like power shortages in the intense heat that we're seeing here at the moment, water difficulties, again in the intense heat that we're seeing here at the moment. And as you say, Muqtada al-Sadr now calling for a million-man march on Baghdad. He hasn't put a date on that yet, but we expect that it may well take place this coming Friday after Friday prayers. All eyes across Iraq, but actually around the region and the world, will be on that march if it does take place to see whether it can take place peacefully. Up to now, the majority of these protests between the two Shiite factions have been very much peaceful, but certainly there are concerns about how things might develop were that to change. Here in Erbil today, the coordination framework have been meeting the Kurdish government, so discussions do go on about how to end this stalemate. But as I say, we are over 10 months now since elections.
Yeah. All right. Thank you for that. With a roundup of news coming through from the Middle East and the Gulf, that's our correspondent, Olly Barratt, there in Erbil in Iraq.